Hey climbers, this is Climb by VSC, a weekly show about building and scaling startups in the world of climate innovation. My name is Vijay Kapoor, general partner of VSC Ventures and co-host of Climb. Every week I or a member of our VSC team will speak with a pioneer in the climate tech world about emerging technologies and novel ideas that will turn the tide on climate change. We've all heard enough of the doom and gloom. It's time for stories of innovation that lead to sustainable positive change. In today's episode, my partner Vijay Chattha speaks with Alex Brown, CEO of Alga Biosciences, who is decreasing agricultural methane emissions by using algae. This topic of curtailing emissions in the US has resurfaced in the public conversations since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm excited for you all to hear how Alga is approaching this problem specifically. As always, I'm so happy that you've decided to join us. Now, let's climb.
Welcome to another edition of Climb, a podcast from VSC Ventures, where we bring on some amazing folks that are in the company building phase in climate technology. And today we are honored to have on Alex Brown, co-founder and CEO of Alga Biosciences. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Vijay. Really appreciate it. Great to be here.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about Alga, the company. How did you and your team decide to start the company?
Yeah, so as a quick overview of what we do, we make a feed additive that stops cows from burping methane and makes farmers money. That's the entire company. Everything is in that one sentence. So I started it along with my friends Caroline and Daria, who are doing their PhDs in chemistry at UC Berkeley. And so they're my co-founders. And we started it, frankly, because we couldn't figure out why nobody else was doing this. It seemed, in my eyes, as one of, if not the most important things to focus on in climate. I thought methane was kind of categorically under-focused on and underinvested in, and could have kind of some of the largest impacts on our actual global warming trajectory. And so this is kind of how we started it. It began early 2021, kind of really working on this area and thinking about, what would a scalable solution look like here? How do we stop these enteric methane emissions, which is cow burps, which are the single largest source of methane in the world? And it was really just kind of a wide open brainstorm for a couple of months of reading as much literature as we could, calling as many professors, farmers, industry people as we could, and really thinking about what would a scalable solution look like here.
Got it. And what was the final summation of that? So like in terms of sort of the product that you decided to make?
Yeah, great. So for a little bit of history, about roughly 5 years ago, scientists in Australia found this species of red seaweed that has this really remarkable effect that when you add it to the feed of cows, it really dramatically reduces their methane emissions. This is great, but it's really hard to grow this stuff. So because it's a strange, undomesticated species. And so you can't produce enough of it to actually make an impact. And you also can't make it nearly cheap enough for any farmer to actually want it, even if you could produce enough. So it's really not something that ends up scaling to address the problem at the magnitude required. And so what we became really interested in is, okay, so this one species isn't going to work, isn't going to be the solution because it doesn't scale. However, seaweed is and kelp is really remarkable because of its ability to scale, because of the sheer amount of biomass that you can produce this way. And, you see companies in the climate space taking advantage of this, like Running Tide, and, lots of companies in the food space and the, apparel space as well. But what we got really interested in is how do we take this seaweed that already scales and we already know how to produce at massive quantities, and how do we transform it into being an equivalent of that special, hard to grow red algae? And so that's really what we developed. And we developed kind of a biochemical process to transform fast growing kelp into turning it into anti-methanogenic feed additive. And so that's what we worked on for 9 months in the lab of just focusing on that. And that's kind of the core of our technology.
Talk to me about these different stages of the genesis of the business.
Yeah. So at first I was just kind of obsessing over the kelp space and what a solution would look like here. So it's kind of funny, started kind of like tricking Caroline and Daria to spend more time on this, where, they were doing their PhDs at Berkeley and say, yeah, come over to San Francisco. Like we're going to, having a party, and then it would just be me with a whiteboard. And we just talk through chemistry for a couple of hours. Then they kind of became more invested and we all kind of ended up convincing ourselves that it was possible, and that the science was doable. And so then the next step was, well, we need to raise money. And it's a kind of a challenge. I'm perpetually jealous of software companies, of, being able to really make a lot of progress with just a computer. And so it's a real challenge of biotech companies of you need to have an actual lab to do things. And so it was a little bit of a chicken and the egg, because I didn't come really from the startup world. So I was trying to figure out how to talk to investors. And, a lot of times investors want to see some evidence that you've made progress on this. And we were like, well, we've got a lot of great plans that we've written down, but that's about it. And so we started doing more chemistry in Daria's kitchen, and doing a lot of our experiments there, so that, we don't want to work in the Berkeley labs. We don't want the IP to be owned by the university at all. And finally, we got kind of our first $20,000 from biotech investors. And that was unbelievable. That unlocked everything, because we rented a lab immediately. We did our first experiments and got our first data back 3 weeks later, I think. And then we got another $120,000 from a climate syndicate, and then got into Y Combinator, and then things just kind of continued to accelerate from there. So it's just like that first step that was really the extremely pivotal catalytic step.
Awesome. So it sounds like the first step really was a false party promotion at your house that really wasn't a party.
Yes. Yes, pretty much.
That's awesome. And sort of like in that process, and again, I'm going in the nitty gritty because we want to educate other founders. Anything in that process between the whiteboard party to YC that either you would have done differently or you wish you would have known about the process? And then also, how did you decide which investors to reach out to? Was this just a Google search? Was it through a network through Berkeley? Just to, again, help other founders think through that process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely didn't do it correctly. So I would say definitely take a more structured approach. I frankly didn't really understand how all of fundraising worked that well. And so began just talking to investors in these climate Slack groups that I was in. So My Climate Journey, Work on Climate. And I was especially I'd been talking to a lot of folks about the intersection of biology and climate, and biotech and climate. And so began kind of talking to those investors. And so slowly became a bit more, structured at understanding, what investors want to hear and what they want to know. Really I think for a company as early as we were, what we needed was something more similar to a fellowship, or a very, I think Activate is a good example. And sort of the money we got was from the Sci Founders Collective, which is a bunch of biotech founders who want to encourage PhD students to drop out of academia. And so that ended up being the right place. So I think what was interesting is really making sure the investors are the right fit for your needs. I think that was something actually that one of your previous guests was really good about, Harsh, of saying, like the point of each round of funding is to get to the next round. And I think in some ways those rounds at the beginning are super short. Like they can be 2 months long of like, you just need to prove that these first assumptions that you're making about your company are right. And then all of a sudden, the capital can grow by orders of magnitude. And so like, I think that was the really important realization for us is like, we need $50,000 at the beginning. And that's enough to really all of a sudden unlock all these next conversations and kind of a more proper seed round.
Where are you in terms of sort of currently on the traction with the product?
Where we're at overall as a company is we spent 2020, all of 2021 and half of 2022 making a product and trying it and working with academics and academic labs to see, hey, are our assumptions correct? Does this work? And luckily it worked really, really well. We had massive methane reductions. And so then since then, what we've been focusing on is actually production capacity and figuring out how to produce this stuff at scale. And so that's what we've been working on kind of the second half, the last 3 quarters of 2022 is producing this stuff at scale and kicking off our first commercial pilots. And so for us, a commercial pilot is not a couple hundred head. We're shooting for, thousands of head on a big feedlot. So a lot of cows, stopping the methane emissions of a lot of cows that are actually part of, the commercial supply chain. And so we're just kind of finishing up our first production run right now and are planning to kick off that commercial pilot this spring.
Talk about your customer and talk about that process. Talk about the objections they've had and how you've handled those. And let's go into that.
Yeah. So our kind of customers are, the beef and dairy producers of America, for starters. And so these are the guys that are making the majority of milk, cheese, meat that this country eats. So a lot of the dairy folks are based here in California. A lot of the beef is in Texas or Kansas or Nebraska. And it's really, really fascinating. It's totally like, it was really fun being part of YC and hanging out with like that group of people all the time, like the YC founders, and then going to CattleCon and hanging out with those guys the other half of my time. It's totally like a fun culture shock. And so it's really fascinating because, in many ways, the cattle industry is totally different than the tech industry, where just by the nature of its, kind of fundamental economics, like it's really, really hard to be a cattleman, honestly, and to own a lot of beef because the margins are incredibly slim. You often don't get paid for months at a time. Like you can get paid maybe only once a year. And your business is really subject to the price of to things totally outside of your control. The price of commodities, of your inputs, of what people are willing to pay for beef. And so because of that, you get a lot of interesting dynamics where it's an industry that's naturally very risk averse. And because one bad year can kind of ruin you. And it's also an industry that is, really wants to see things proven out before they adopt them, which is part of risk averse. But so that was like a very interesting thing for me is what became so important when kind of integrating with this community. And I think with tech, like you could go say to a room full of folks working at tech companies and say, hey, you want to try my product that I'm building? Like I'll let you try it for free, like for a couple of weeks. And they'd say, sure, why not? It's not how it works in the cattle industry. You have to really kind of build a sense of trust and get to know people and have them get to know you before they're going to believe anything you're saying. And so it became, what was really interesting is I thought most of the, work that I'd have to do was telling people about the product and showing them our scientific papers. But actually it was like getting to know them and having them get to know me. They're like, who are you? Some dude from San Francisco, like telling me how to run my business that, that's been in my family for 3 generations. Like, no way. And so that became really, really interesting. And was one of the really fun parts of the process.
One thing you sort of brought up when I first met you, and I thought it was super valuable, is like, in the end of the day, a lot of customers are not buying because of saving the planet, right? And that was a big part of your pitch to the community, right? About the value prop to them as cattlemen. So can you talk a little bit about that process and how you're really selling and what's working?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, this is like when we talk about the founding story, this is the reason I became obsessed with this space. And it's so for context, what's really special here is there's a hidden cost for these methane emissions for the farmer, and they're totally unacknowledged right now. And this is because methane, it's chock full of energy, right? Like that's why we use it for fuel. And so when that cow's burping out methane, they're losing energy. And so it's about 15% of the calories a farmer feeds his cow get just turned into this this useless methane and burped out, totally wasted. And that cost is kind of invisible right now to farmers because, there isn't a way to stop these emissions. But feed costs are the single largest cost for a feedlot farmer. And so this absolutely could transform their bottom line. And so that's what got me so excited about this is, there's so few areas in climate where both a solution is possible and the incentives are aligned. Like usually you need a concession from somebody, either like you need a new government regulation saying, hey, you can't use this old inefficient process anymore. Like you got to buy a more expensive, whatever. But this is a case where you can actually genuinely have a win-win where the farmers, they don't have to care about, what the methane target of the United States is. We don't have to care like what we want our methane levels to get to. All they care about is making their cows more efficient. And so that's what got me really, really excited. And that's what we've started to see in our studies. And so that's kind of the long-term value prop for farmers here is, sure, there's going to be methane regulation coming down the line. Like we see this already in California. But really like we're doing this as a way to just increase the efficiency of your operation. Also kind of in the near term, we're also working before we kind of finalize proving out those efficiency gains because we want to make sure that, we prove it on a really big operation, like one of these big commercial farms before we start, charging farmers for that and really proving that out. And so we're starting with carbon credits of saying like, hey, nobody's able to reduce methane emissions yet. And so we're like going to prove that we can reduce these methane emissions and sell carbon credits for that to kind of kickstart these pilots.
Got it. And tell me about carbon credit, that process. So like, how does that functionally work?
Yeah, a lot of negative. It's been getting trashed the past couple of weeks, which I think probably rightly so in some of them. But there's a lot of bullshit carbon credits out there, I think. But it's really interesting because there's kind of 2 carbon credit markets. There's the voluntary carbon credit market and there's the regulatory carbon credit market. Regulatory carbon credit market, this is the EU has this. This is like a cap and trade scheme. California also has a regulatory carbon credit market, which is really interesting. We can talk about. And these are, pretty efficient markets. There's like an actual price that a ton of carbon trades for. In the EU, it's roughly $75. I haven't looked in a couple months. Maybe it's somewhere around there. And in California, it's roughly $30. And however, the voluntary carbon credit market is still the Wild West. And so this is, the voluntary carbon credit market, it comes from mostly companies acting to hit their internal targets that aren't yet imposed by, say, a government, but they've made ESG commitments or commitments to shareholders or they want to like market, being a carbon neutral company. And so these are, companies buying carbon credits or carbon offsets purely out of voluntary, without any legal need. And so as a result, you've got a really wide range of price and quality on the voluntary carbon credit market. And prices range from $2 a ton to $2,000 per ton, which if everything's a ton of carbon, it shouldn't matter. Like that price should be exactly the same, but it's not. And it's because like the stuff at the really low end is, say, things where it's really hard to prove whether you're actually reducing emissions. I think a good example of this is like forestry credits. You've got, you can sell carbon credits associated with owning a forest and saying we're not going to chop it down, and so that's obviously pretty inexpensive, but it's also hard to verify that you really were going to chop it down where you're not paid this money, and also verify that there isn't leakage, like another forest isn't going to just get chopped down instead. And then all the way up to the really high end, which is like really amazing projects that direct air capture, where it's actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and, say, putting it in concrete. And so that's obviously clearly wouldn't have happened were it not for the credit. It's super permanent. It's going to last forever. It's in concrete. And so those are like the really high quality ones. But you get this massive span. And so what's really important for us is for like having a high quality credit is both having really good validation, showing that, hey, we're not giving you an estimate of the methane reductions. We've got, hard data showing what these reductions are. And so, exactly what you're paying for, and these reductions are real. And also, we're lucky that the additionality is super clear here. Like these farmers wouldn't be adopting this feed additive were it not for the carbon credit. And also like the permanence. Like this is a really great thing about methane. We don't have to, unlike say carbon sequestration, where you have to prove that the carbon is going to stay stored forever, or at least for 100 years. We can just say, hey, we're just stopping the methane emissions during this, say, month-long period. And so all you have to know is that during this period, that methane wasn't released. We aren't like storing it and promising it'll never release. We're just stopping it during this period. And so that is what kind of allows us, that's a recipe for having very high quality carbon credits, which I think is important, because like if we're actually going to use carbon credits as a world to hit global warming targets, we need them to be really easy to account for and have a lot less blurry numbers around them.
One thing we didn't actually really get to was actually the pitch to the farmer. So you're saying more efficiency. Does that, specifically you're saying that means less food per cow, needs less feed per cow? Or are you saying less cost? Like specifically, how does that break down?
Yeah. So we're actually starting with, when I talk about risk averse farmers, and also like we want to make sure that we're always like keeping our word to farmers and our customers. So we start with saying like, hey, we haven't proved out the efficiency gains yet on a massive commercial feedlot. So we're not going to guarantee them. We're not going to promise you'll get them. But what we are going to do is give you the feed additive for free, and generate carbon credits here and give you a slice of the carbon credit revenue. And so that basically you can get a free trial, and we can see how this works, and actually generate some money as well. And so that's kind of the intro. But then, as you mentioned, the real value is these efficiency gains. And what this looks like can actually vary from farm to farm a bit. Typically, like in beef cattle, what you'll see is, hey, the cow eats 10% less, but grows to the same size. And that's great. That's just like super easy math of, we just have 10% feed savings. That's worth a lot of money. On a dairy farm, a lot of times what you'll see is the cow eats the same amount, but she's producing an extra 8 pounds of milk per day. And like, that's also really easy math there of like calculating the value. But I mean, ultimately it's one number, which is feed conversion efficiency. It's basically how much output are you getting from what you feed your animal. And so that is the number that we really target and we really focus on. And our farmers, like, that's top of their mind as well.
Yeah, amazing. And so feed conversion efficiency, was that what you said?
Yeah.
Is that a new KPI that you've made, or is that one that was in the market before you came?
That was in the market, but it's probably new to most of our investors for their investor updates. It's not a KPI that probably a lot of their other startups are reporting. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. Like when I was when I was at CattleCon last year, it was, one of the hot products that everyone was talking about had a 2% improvement in feed conversion efficiency. And so, I mean, that just gives you some insight into how thin the margins are in this business and how important like that number is. And also gives you some insight into when we're saying, hey, we think we'll have 10% plus feed conversion efficiency improvements. People are like, get out of here. Like, no way. Because like it's really unprecedented. And the amount of energy that we can conserve here. And so that's kind of the context of that number in the industry.
Got it. And sort of back to just sort of even the sort of areas of passion for our firm too, is how much, what's been the role of storytelling and awareness, and especially for these audiences like cattlemen, like, is it obviously a lot of face-to-face time, but
yeah,
has publicity ever helped as sort of, what kind of marketing have you learned matters at what stage?
I've found maybe the most interesting thing and helpful, at least in understanding this market, is really listening and understanding to the cattle industry and the way they approach these problems. So I think historically, like, the cattle industry has felt very maligned by environmentalists because they think, hey, listen, I care about, conserving, this land. Like, what do you mean I'm bad for the environment? I care about conserving this land. I pass it on to my kids. I got it from my dad. Like, I absolutely care about conservation. And, I don't want to hear that all of a sudden, methane is this massive issue when we've had cows here forever. And before that, there were buffalo. And I don't understand why this is like why I'm being unfairly attacked here. And I think on the other side, the environmentalists often don't understand the cattle industry. And partially they don't understand methane. Saying, well, actually, there's some truth in what the farmers are saying. Like, the total amount of methane produced by the cows hasn't really changed over the years. And so you aren't getting it's a little different than cars. And so I think it's like bridging that gap of saying, hey, like, we're not approaching this from an angle of, you're a new thing that's terrible for the environment and we need to get rid of immediately. It's approaching it from a perspective of like, hey, we're approaching this from a efficiency gains perspective. And like, we want to bridge this conversation between these two groups, because I think this is another reason why solutions like ours haven't been developed, is that there isn't that much communication between the folks who are working on sustainability and the folks in the middle, in the heart of the beef and dairy industry. And I think that's changing, which is really good. But I think we need to continue having those conversations and really figuring out what folks' perspective is, because it's genuinely very, very different.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think we're at our time. So Alex, I want to thank you for fantastic discussion. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm really thankful that now we could share these insights with our community. I keep loving the beef sign behind you. I'm glad you have no beef with these different communities. Got to bring them all together here to be successful. And just want to thank everybody. The company's Alga Biosciences, and you can find them online at alga.bio.
Yeah,
and
we're hiring.
And the company's hiring. So go to the website, check out the jobs. Everybody in big tech thinking about getting in the climate, alga.bio. Let's go.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. A few quick shout outs before you go. Our thanks to Alex for sharing his deep knowledge on all things algae with us. You can learn more about them at www.alga.bio. Special thanks to Credo for their help in producing and promoting this episode. To visit any part of today's conversation again, you can find the full transcript on vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Ramiro for posting these every week. Lastly, if you've listened this far, please leave us a rating on Spotify or a review on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I know, it's still carbon neutral. That's it for now. We'll see you all next week on Climb by VSC.